Okay, so here's part 2 then of the video, which unhelpfully cut off. So I know that I am writing about the theme of loss. I've just written about A Wife in London for 20 minutes. I've now got to think, what poem could I pick which is also about loss? Now, a general strategy that you've been recommended is to go away and revise a smaller group of multi-themed poems. So rather than choose from 17 poems, you ideally should be picking from a much smaller group of number of poems that you know well. So I have told my class to look at some poems like The Manhunt and Dolce Decorum Est, which are obviously poems that I am thinking are also about loss. Now, I am going to choose The Manhunt because not only is this part of the small group of poems that I know well, I think I could write about loss better comparing The Manhunt to A Wife in London than I would if I wrote about Dolce Decorum Est. I know Dolce Decorum Est as well as The Manhunt, but actually in terms of the comparison, I think I can think of more comparisons between The Manhunt and A Wife in London. So I'm not going to pick Dolce Decorum Est. I would pick this one instead. So you will have to go through some sort of process of going through the poems you know well, the poems you can write from memory, and you need to think, what's the best one that's got this same theme that I could choose to write about? Because this is where it gets tricky. And you cannot really complete this question very well if you do not have knowledge of the poem that you've chosen to write about. So I'm going to imagine I'm a good student who's gone away and done my revision, and I do know a small group of poems well, and I'm confidently picking The Manhunt. I've now got to really think, well, what are my 3 comparisons? Because I want to try and have 3 comparisons between The Manhunt and A Wife in London, because The Manhunt is the poem I've chosen. Now, I know comparisons can be similarities, so they might be what's the same. They might also be differences. Now, it does not matter if they're all similarities. It does not matter if they're all differences. It does not matter if they're a mixture of the two. It's connections between the poems, and those connections might be similar, those connections might be different, but I've got to think about these connections. Now, my first connection is a similarity. I know they both focus on the loss of a wife. However, I know there is also a difference, because I know that The Manhunt is about loss of old self, whereas A Wife in London is about the loss of life and the loss of the whole relationship. So that's going to be my second point. So then my third point could be, so I've looked at a similarity that they both focus on the loss of a wife. I've looked at a difference. They've looked at the loss of the old self. And I think my third is going to be a similarity, is this idea of loss causes isolation. However, in The Manhunt, it's isolation of Eddie from his old self, whereas in A Wife in London, it's the isolation of the wife now her husband is gone. Now, what you'll see here is I've sort of got a similarity and a difference combined. That's absolutely fine, because they're similar in the fact that we see 2 different sets of people who are isolated, but they're isolated for different reasons. So once I've thought about my comparisons, then I've now got to think about my evidence. Now, that's easy for A Wife in London because I've got a copy of that and I've just written about it for 20 minutes. And this is where you needing to know a smaller group of poems really well is important, because I need to be able to comment now on The Manhunt, ideally using quotations. So loss of a wife. So I've got to think about this whole idea of Laura's loss in the manhunt. So I'm going to focus on the only then did I come close, because actually right at the end of the poem we know that it's only once she'd traced his physical and mental injuries that she could come close to understanding him, because she has lost the old Eddie. Yeah, he's not the same. I could have done sweating unexploded mine. You know, the bit about it buried deep in his mind, the fact that because of his PTSD, he's a new person, she's lost the man he used to be. Either quote would be fine. And now I've got to think about one from A Wife in London. So again, this is a little bit easier because you've got the poem in front of you. So the loss of a wife. I'm going to say he has fallen in the far south land. So this is showing literal loss because he's died. So again, the difference, the manhunt, loss of old self. I'm going to think frozen river, which ran through his face, because this is showing that, again, he's lost who he physically used to be. You know, he's got the scarrings from his injuries. But the loss of her whole relationship, I'm going to, from A Wife in London, what am I going to pick? I'm going to say a new love. No, I'm not. Penned full of his hope to return. Because obviously he writes this, the tragedy is he writes this letter of all of the things they're going to do when he returns from war, but obviously none of those things are going to happen. So she's lost her relationship with him. So finally, loss causes isolation. So the manhunt, I've got to think about something that shows that he's isolated. Maybe I could do feel the hurt of his grazed heart. Then in A Wife of London, I'm going to do she sits. No, I'm not going to do the fog hangs thicker. So essentially what I've got here is I've got a plan. Now, I always say this when I model plans, I'm modeling this and writing it out fully because I want to try and show you how to do it. I would not expect someone to necessarily write something in this level of detail in the exam. I mean, if you think you can do it in under 5 minutes, go for it. You don't really want to spend more than 5 minutes planning. But fundamentally, what I want you to get here is the process. So I know my theme is loss. I'm going to go to my smaller group of poems from the anthology of the ones I know well. What's my best combination? Then I need to think, okay, what are 3 similarities or differences? And then I've got to think, particularly from my poem that I'm writing about from memory, what quotations could I use? Now, you might be sitting here and thinking, Miss, what if I can't remember any quotes? My answer to you would be, for the real exam, when it's not a mock, because this video is preparing you for your first year 11 mock, if we're going away and saying revise 5-6 poems, you need to really be able to quote from those 5-6 poems to do well in this section of the exam. But if, let's imagine you've done that and your brain goes completely blank, you can use direct references. This means something you remember from the manhunt, but you don't remember the actual quote. That is better than nothing, certainly. Always write something. You will gain some marks, but ideally you do want to quote. But if your brain goes blank, you can't specifically quote, or you're not sure if your quote is right, just do a direct reference when it comes to your second poem. Obviously, with the poem you have to write about, you're going to have a copy there. So once I've done that, I need to begin writing. I've then got my overview. And I'm going to want to say something like, I have chosen to compare the manhunts to A Wife in London because both poems focus on the loss of the wife of a soldier. So I'm saying I've chosen to compare this poem and this is how they're similar. However, the manhunt focuses on the loss of how their relationship used to be, whereas A Wife in London focuses on the loss of her husband's life. So I've essentially got, this is the poem I've chosen to compare because this is how they're similar in terms of loss. Then I've got, here's how they're different. Okay, that's my overview. I'm then going to go, a similarity between both poems is that they both focus on the loss of a wife. For example, in The Manhunt, when we are told, only then did I come close, it shows, Laura's loss because blah, blah, blah. Similarly, in A Wife in London, then I'm looking at my second quote. So this is essentially going to be my first little comparative section. So after my overview, I'm going to want to do this. Then I'm going to want to do this. Then I'm going to want to write this out. So once I've done my overview, I've got my first point, my comparative point, and then my analysis of each quotation. I've got my second comparative point, my analysis of each quotation. I've got my third comparative point and my analysis of each quotation. Now, there's one important word. Context. Just like question 1, you are marked explicitly on your ability to add in context. Now, obviously, you don't want to just be repeating everything you've just said on A Wife in London, but you may want to, again, illustrate the point you're making by embedding a little bit of that information in, but you particularly want to show that you do have contextual information about manhunts. You know that it's, the wife is called Laura, her husband is Eddie. He was injured during the Bosnian War by a bullet that ricocheted around his body. We know that he suffered from PTSD, all of these things. That is contextual information that needs to be embedded in, not in everything, not in every single quote you analyse or every single thing you say, but context does need to be in there and you do need to be revising context. So hopefully now you've watched the end of this second video and hopefully this is actually going to work when I upload it. We now feel that we can be prepared to answer literature paper 1.